We are examining the topic of the temple of God. I have shared with you that temple was an incredibly powerful concept to the Jewish mind, to the people of the ancient Near East. Temple represented the presence of God, whether the pagan gods or the God of Israel. And even though Yahweh's temple set in the midst of Israel represented his presence with them, one incredibly powerful point that you must catch is the fact that even though the temple represented the presence of God among Israel, at the same time it represented separation from God because of the veil. You had the outer veil, you had the inner veil. It meant no access to the most holy place. The writer of Hebrews says that in Hebrews 9, 6 and following. We'll have more to say about that at a different time. And yet, Yahweh predicted, even after establishing the tabernacle, even after establishing the Solomonic temple among them, that the time was coming in which he would build a greater temple. Now, we're overlooking an awful lot of stuff. I say overlooking, we're skipping over an awful lot of stuff, but this topic is really vast. So I'm really only able to hit some of the highlights. We are focusing on the prophecy of Isaiah 2 through 4. Isaiah 2 through 4 is a united prophecy. We shared with you point number 1 that Isaiah said that this Messianic temple would be established in the last days. Now, I've written a book, The Last Days Identified. I want you to catch the power of this. Folks, if we're not in the last days, and we're not, then the temple either failed to be rebuilt or the temple's already been rebuilt, and it was in the first century. If you've got questions about the identity of the last days and all the paranoia of people saying, oh, we're in the last days, we're in the last days. No, we're not. This book will help you identify the reality that the last days, as biblically defined, were the last days of Old Covenant Israel, not the last days of time, not the last days of the Christian age. Okay, notice that Isaiah said, Isaiah chapter 2, verse 2 and following, it shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on top of the mountains, shall be exalted above the hills. All nations shall flow into it. Notice this term, mountain of the Lord's house. Now, a lot of people say, well, how do you know this is the temple? Well, because the term house of God, just that term alone, I'm not talking about house of the Lord. The house of God, that term is used 80 times in the New King James translation alone to speak of the Old Covenant temple. It was a term that the Jews recognized referred to nothing but the temple of Yahweh. Now, when Isaiah therefore predicted the establishment of the temple or the house of God, it meant the establishment of the Messianic temple. Now, you really have to latch on to the next point. The New Testament writers were looking for, eagerly expecting the fulfillment of the Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. We have already shown you how the New Testament writers said they were living in the last days. I've shown you they said they were living in the days foretold by the Old Covenant prophets. Acts chapter 3. Now, watch this. Paul emphatically said that his hope, his eschatological hope, was nothing but the hope of Israel, found in Moses, the law, and the prophets, Acts 24, 14 and following. Well, as he writes to the Ephesians, in Ephesians chapter 2, 19 and following, he says, now therefore you are no longer strangers or foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God, having been built on, now watch the temple imagery, having been built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone. As we will see in our study, the chief cornerstone is nothing less, nothing other than the chief cornerstone for the Messianic temple. in whom, that is in Christ, the whole building being framed together grows into a holy temple of the Lord. Here is Paul, who said his one hope, his only hope, was the fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. And here he is talking about Jews and Gentiles being brought together in one body in Christ, built upon the chief cornerstone of Jesus, the foundation of the apostles and prophets, going together to build the temple of God. And then what did he call that temple of God? Well, for that, we go to 1 Timothy chapter 3, in which Paul writes to Timothy, and he says, "These things I'm writing to you, hoping to come unto you shortly, but in order that you might know how you ought to conduct yourself in the house of God." Now, wait a minute. House of God was the normal vernacular, the normal idiom for the temple. And Paul says, I'm writing to you, Timothy, so that you might know how to conduct yourself in the house of God. Now watch this, which is the church of the living God. Now look, Paul's hope, Paul's doctrine, Paul's gospel was taken directly from the Old Covenant. The Old Covenant predicted the establishment of the house of God, i.e. the Messianic Temple. And Paul told Timothy, I'm writing to tell you how to conduct yourself in the house of God, i.e. the temple, which is the church of the living God. Folks, this is tantamount to saying Isaiah chapter 2 was being fulfilled. As Paul says in Ephesians chapter 2, it was under construction. You are being built up a temple of God. Present active indicative in the Greek. So, Isaiah said the temple would be built in the last days. The New Testament writers said they were in the last days. Isaiah said the house of God would be established. Paul, who got his eschatological hope from the Old Testament, said the house of God, the temple, was under construction in the first century. He wasn't talking about a different temple of God. He wasn't talking about a different house of God. He was talking about the promised temple, the house of God promised in Isaiah chapter 2. And that meant the temple of God, as foretold in Isaiah 2, was not to be a physical, literal edifice built on a literal, physical hill in Jerusalem. It was the church of the living God. Fantastic stuff. Get a copy of my book, The Last Days Identified. It will explain this critical issue of the identity of the last days. Hey, thanks for joining me. We'll see you on the flip side with even more.